Jack readjusted his tie in the mirror, straightening it for what felt like the 10th time. He leaned closer, studying the faint signs of age creeping into his once youthful face, a few lines around his eyes, a touch of gray just beginning to show at his temples. He was proud of the lines, though. They were the marks of a man who had worked hard and, in his mind, achieved the success he deserved. At 45, Jack had become a respected figure in the corporate world. He had built his own company from the ground up, turning a small startup into a powerful, profitable enterprise. Tonight, he would attend one of the most significant networking events of his career, hosted by an influential investor named James Collins. Jack took a step back from the mirror, smoothing the front of his tailored suit, feeling that familiar sense of self-satisfaction. Success was his, but his relentless ambition often left him preoccupied. He had to be at his best tonight. The people he'd meet weren't just important, they could open doors he'd only dreamed of. As he walked into the bedroom, Jack found Sarah sitting at her vanity, brushing her long, dark hair. She was beautiful in a subtle, almost unassuming way, with a natural grace that contrasted with the polished, glitzy women he often encountered at work events. He had loved that simplicity once, loved that she was comfortable without makeup, that she laughed at his jokes, that she saw the good in everyone. But now, Jack struggled with a silent frustration. He couldn't pinpoint when it had started, but over time, her simplicity had begun to feel inadequate. "Are you ready for tonight?" she asked, smiling as she glanced at him in the mirror. Jack hesitated. Sarah didn't know he hadn't planned on taking her to the event. He had already invited Liz, a woman he'd been seeing for the past few months. She was sophisticated, confident, and the kind of person who could command a room without saying a word. To Jack, Liz represented the life he had worked so hard to attain, a life that didn't quite seem to match Sarah's quiet, unpretentious presence. "Actually," he said slowly, trying to avoid meeting her eyes, "I was thinking it might be better if I went alone tonight. It's mostly business, and I wouldn't want you to feel out of place." Sarah's smile faltered, but she quickly replaced it with a gentle nod. "Of course. I understand. I'll have a quiet night in, then." She set her brush down and turned to face him, her gaze warm and supportive. "Just remember to be yourself, Jack. That's always been enough." Jack's chest tightened. Her words felt like a weight pressing on him, reminding him of how she had been his rock in those early days when the company was struggling, when success had been nothing but a dream. She had believed in him even when he hadn't believed in himself. Yet here he was, ashamed to bring her to a room filled with people he wanted to impress. He offered a tight smile. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll do my best." As he left the room, he couldn't shake the discomfort lingering in his chest. Sarah had always been there, supporting him quietly, her love unwavering. But for reasons he couldn't quite admit, he felt as though she didn't belong in the world he was now so eager to conquer. And so, leaving her behind felt like a necessary sacrifice, a choice that, he told himself, was for the best. As Jack's car navigated through the bustling city streets, he glanced at his phone. Liz had texted him a single word, excited. He felt a thrill of anticipation, a feeling that had become all too rare in his life lately. Liz was everything he'd come to admire in the corporate world, bold, stylish, and strikingly beautiful. She knew how to carry herself with an air of sophistication that seemed effortless, as if she were meant for the luxurious dinners and exclusive networking events that were now his reality. When he pulled up to her building, Liz stepped out, draped in a sleek black dress that accentuated her figure in a way that turned heads. She wore heels that seemed impossibly high and an expensive perfume that lingered in the car as she slid into the seat beside him. She leaned over to kiss him on the cheek, her bright red lipstick leaving a mark he quickly wiped away. Liz laughed, a sound both sultry and confident, as if she knew the effect she had on him and didn't mind flaunting it. "Are you ready for tonight?" she asked, a playful gleam in her eye. Jack nodded, feeling a strange mix of excitement and guilt. A part of him knew that bringing Liz instead of Sarah was a betrayal, but he pushed the thought aside. Tonight, he was determined to focus on making a strong impression on James Collins, the influential investor who had the power to propel his business to new heights. and he was convinced that Liz's presence would only strengthen that impression. "You look incredible," Jack said, giving her an approving nod. "Exactly what I needed tonight." Liz smiled, her confidence filling the car. She was so different from Sarah. Where Sarah was gentle and grounded, Liz was fiery and bold. She didn't hesitate to speak her mind, to make her presence known. It was the type of energy that fit perfectly into his vision of success, a vision that had little room for modesty or quiet devotion. As they arrived at the venue, Liz stepped out of the car with the ease of someone used to being in the spotlight. Her entrance was magnetic, heads turned as she walked through the lobby, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Jack followed, feeling an immediate surge of pride. For a moment, he forgot about Sarah entirely, caught up in the thrill of being seen with someone who looked and acted like Liz. They approached the check-in table, where Liz greeted the staff with a dazzling smile, charming them effortlessly. Jack couldn't help but admire how naturally she fit into this environment, as if she belonged here in a way Sarah never could. Sarah's humility and quiet presence, though once comforting, now seemed out of place in his world of power and ambition. Jack had convinced himself that he needed someone like Liz by his side if he was to climb the highest rungs of his career ladder. As they made their way toward the main event hall, Liz looped her arm through his, leaning close. "Tonight's going to be amazing," she whispered. "I can feel it." Jack nodded, allowing himself to be swept up in her confidence. He had everything he wanted for the evening, the perfect setting, the perfect opportunity, and the perfect companion. The nagging doubts that had surfaced earlier in the night began to fade, replaced by the thrill of the moment. Tonight, he told himself, would be a turning point, a night that would redefine his life and cement his place among the elite. What he didn't realize, however, was how quickly that certainty would begin to crumble. The grand ballroom was aglow with chandeliers casting a warm, golden light over the crowd. The space was filled with laughter, murmurs, and the clinking of glasses as finely dressed guests mingled. Jack felt a rush of excitement as he and Liz entered the room. This was the kind of setting he craved, elegant, exclusive, filled with people who, like him, were at the pinnacle of their careers. Beside him, Liz looked effortlessly poised, her eyes scanning the room with an air of confidence. She placed a manicured hand on his arm, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Relax," she whispered with a smile. "You've got this." Jack nodded, feeling emboldened by her words. She seemed to bring out a side of him that he'd kept dormant for too long, a part of him that longed to be recognized and admired. He glanced around the room, eager to spot James Collins, the man he was so determined to impress tonight. It didn't take long for them to find him. Collins was standing near the bar, deep in conversation with a group of executives. He was a tall man with silver hair and a commanding presence, known for his discerning taste in both people and business ventures. Jack took a steadying breath, straightened his tie, and began to lead Liz toward Collins, determined to make the introduction as seamless as possible. As they approached, Collins noticed them and offered a polite smile, extending his hand. "Jack Reed," he said, shaking Jack's hand firmly. "Good to finally meet you in person. I've heard impressive things about your company." "Thank you, Mr. Collins," Jack replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "It's an honor to be here." Collins's gaze shifted briefly to Liz, who was standing at Jack's side, exuding confidence. Jack quickly introduced her. "This is Liz," he said, choosing to avoid specifics about their relationship. Liz offered her hand with a graceful smile, and Collins gave a slight nod of approval. "It's a pleasure," Liz said smoothly, her voice calm and refined. "Jack's been looking forward to this night for weeks." They began to talk, with Jack highlighting his company's recent successes and his plans for expansion. Liz chimed in occasionally, offering compliments that seemed to reinforce Jack's achievements. Collins seemed attentive, nodding as he listened, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Liz was charming, no doubt about it, but there was a disconnect, a lack of depth in her remarks that felt superficial. Jack tried to ignore the unease creeping into his thoughts. He told himself he was overthinking things, that tonight was about making the right impression. But as the conversation continued, Jack noticed Collins's attention drift. the investor's gaze moved subtly across the room, lingering on a group of people gathered near the center. Jack turned slightly, following Collins's line of sight, and felt a jolt of recognition. There, standing in a circle of guests, was Sarah. She was laughing softly, her dark hair falling over her shoulder as she listened to an older woman speak. Dressed in a simple, elegant dress, Sarah looked completely at ease, her natural grace shining through. For a moment, Jack forgot where he was. He watched Sarah interact with the group, noticing how at ease everyone seemed around her. She wasn't forcing smiles or feigning interest, she was simply being herself, and people were drawn to her because of it. The gentle warmth in her expression, the genuine interest she showed in others, it was a stark contrast to the practiced charm that filled the room. Collins seemed to sense Jack's distraction and followed his gaze. "Ah, Sarah," he remarked, a note of admiration in his voice. "Quite the woman, isn't she?" Jack felt a strange mix of pride and guilt swell inside him. "Yes," he replied quietly, unsure of what else to say. "I know her well," Collins continued. "Her work with the foundation has been a blessing. A true asset to the community." He paused, giving Jack a thoughtful look. "She's one of those rare people who bring out the best in everyone around them." Jack forced a smile, nodding, but inside he was reeling. It was as if he were seeing Sarah through new eyes, realizing how much he had taken for granted. She belonged here in a way that had nothing to do with appearances or status. Her authenticity, her kindness, these were qualities he hadn't fully appreciated until now. Meanwhile, Liz continued chatting, oblivious to the shift in Jack's focus. But Jack's attention had moved elsewhere, drawn back to Sarah and the simple, genuine way she carried herself. For the first time that evening, his certainty began to waver, and the thrill he'd felt upon arriving started to slip away, replaced by a nagging sense of doubt. Jack struggled to focus on the conversation with Collins. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah, who was still engaged in animated conversation across the room. She was surrounded by a small group of guests, all of whom seemed captivated by whatever she was saying. Jack felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, regret, perhaps, or even admiration. Liz, sensing his distraction, nudged him gently and leaned in close. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her eyes searching his face. "Fine," he murmured, pulling himself back to the present. He forced a smile and turned his attention back to Collins, who was discussing a project he had been funding, a local initiative focused on community development and sustainable practices, something that Jack knew Sarah would deeply appreciate. Liz, however, seemed uninterested, her attention wandering to her reflection in a nearby mirror as she adjusted her lipstick discreetly. Collins paused mid-sentence, glancing at Liz before turning back to Jack, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "As I was saying, this project has been a personal passion of mine. It's rare to find people who truly understand the impact of philanthropy on a local level." Jack nodded quickly, trying to fill the gap. "Absolutely, Mr. Collins. I believe that community-focused projects are vital for sustainable growth," he replied, though his words felt hollow. He remembered how Sarah often spoke passionately about projects like this, her eyes lighting up whenever she discussed ways to give back to the community. It was a genuine interest, one that she would never fake or brush off. Before Jack could elaborate, Liz interrupted with a bright, practiced smile. "That sounds interesting, James," she said, using the informality in a way that felt overly familiar. "But isn't it true that these kinds of projects are more about the image of the company than real impact?" The question hung in the air, awkward and ill-timed. Jack's stomach tightened, and he shot Liz a sharp look, silently willing her to stop. Collins's expression shifted subtly, a hint of disapproval flickering in his eyes. He cleared his throat, his tone cool. "I suppose that depends on who's involved. I'd like to think that some people engage in philanthropy for reasons beyond publicity." Liz seemed to catch his displeasure and quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. Jack felt the weight of Collins's disappointment, an almost tangible shift in the investor's demeanor. The conversation quickly fizzled, and Collins excused himself to speak with another guest, leaving Jack and Liz standing alone. Liz seemed unbothered, glancing around the room as if nothing had happened. But Jack's face burned with embarrassment. Collins had been unimpressed, and Jack knew he'd made a critical mistake in bringing Liz instead of Sarah. For the first time, he fully realized that Liz didn't have the depth or sincerity that Sarah embodied so naturally. She lacked the qualities that made people like Collins respect and trust Sarah, the qualities that made Sarah an asset in any room. He couldn't shake the feeling of regret as he glanced over at Sarah again, who was now listening intently to a guest sharing a personal story. Her expression was kind, compassionate, and completely genuine. People gravitated toward her because she made them feel heard and valued. In contrast, Jack could now see that Liz's charm was merely surface deep, a polished exterior without the warmth or substance that truly mattered. "Jack?" Liz's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone laced with impatience. "Are you all right? You seem distracted." He forced a tight smile, nodding. "I'm fine," he replied, though he felt anything but fine. A gnawing doubt had taken root, an awareness that perhaps he had made a serious error in judgment. As Liz began chatting with another guest nearby, Jack found himself thinking back to all the times Sarah had encouraged and supported him. She'd been there through every struggle, every setback, always offering her quiet strength. She had believed in him when he barely believed in himself. And now, as he stood in this crowded ballroom, surrounded by strangers and colleagues, he felt the sting of his own ingratitude. Jack's first real doubt had surfaced, and it clung to him like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing moment. He looked over at Sarah one last time, feeling a pang of longing mixed with remorse. For the first time that night, he wondered if he had been pursuing the wrong things, if perhaps the success he valued so highly had cost him more than he was willing to admit. Jack took a deep breath, trying to dispel the uneasy feeling growing within him. Liz was now chatting with a small group of executives, seemingly unaware of the subtle damage her earlier comments had caused. Jack gave her a polite nod as he excused himself, needing a moment alone to gather his thoughts. He walked to the other side of the ballroom, feeling his gaze drawn, almost involuntarily, toward the center of the room where Sarah was still standing. She was surrounded by a few guests, each one visibly drawn to her as she spoke with a quiet charm that seemed to fill the space. The glow of the chandelier cast a soft light on her face, highlighting her natural beauty. Jack felt a strange pang in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in a long time. Then, to his surprise, one of the guests in Sarah's circle looked over, caught Jack's eye, and waved him over with a welcoming smile. It was Patrick Wallace, an old friend from Jack's early days in business, someone he hadn't seen in years but who had always been loyal and supportive. Patrick gestured for Jack to join them, and Jack, unsure of what else to do, moved toward the group, hoping that Sarah wouldn't feel uncomfortable with his sudden presence. As Jack reached them, Patrick extended a hearty handshake. "Jack. Long time no see, my friend. You've really made a name for yourself." He chuckled, glancing at Sarah. "I was just telling your lovely wife here how you two were an unstoppable team back in the day." Jack gave an awkward smile, feeling an uncomfortable warmth creeping up his neck. He glanced at Sarah, whose expression was calm and kind, as if she had long ago mastered the art of keeping her emotions in check. She gave him a small, polite nod, acknowledging him without any hint of bitterness. But her eyes held a depth that Jack found hard to read, an inner strength mixed with a silent sadness. "Yes, Sarah's always been my greatest support," Jack said, his voice softer than usual. As he spoke, he realized how true those words were, though he had rarely said them aloud. The other guests chimed in, sharing their admiration for Sarah's work with a local charity organization. Jack listened, feeling an unexpected sense of pride as they praised her dedication, her compassion, and the countless hours she'd put into helping families in need. These were things he had known, yet somehow, standing here among people who recognized her worth, he was struck anew by her selflessness. One of the guests, a woman named Grace who seemed particularly fond of Sarah, leaned in with a smile. "Sarah has such a gift for connecting with people. It's rare to find someone so genuine in today's world." Sarah blushed slightly, brushing off the compliment with a modest smile. "Thank you, Grace. I just try to do my part." Her humility was disarming, a sharp contrast to the calculated confidence that Jack had come to admire in others like Liz. In this moment, he could see how Sarah's quiet strength was, in fact, the kind of presence that commanded true respect. As he stood there, surrounded by people who valued her deeply, he realized with painful clarity how much he had taken for granted. Patrick looked at Jack with a teasing smile. "So, Jack, where did you find the time to win over a woman like Sarah? She's got all of us here absolutely captivated." Jack forced a chuckle, though his heart felt heavy. "I'm lucky, that's all." Sarah glanced at him, a hint of sadness flickering in her gaze before she quickly looked away. The ease and warmth with which she interacted with everyone around her was unmistakable, and Jack felt a pang of regret. These people appreciated her for who she was, not for what she could bring to them in terms of status or connections. It was a sobering contrast to the shallow validation he had been chasing all night. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder what his life would look like if he had fully valued her presence, if he had been the kind of husband who saw her worth clearly from the start. The realization was unsettling, cutting through the layers of pride and ambition he had spent years building up. As the group's conversation continued, Jack found himself drawn into their discussion about philanthropy and community service, something he hadn't truly engaged with in years. Sarah spoke with passion about her current project, a program that provided resources for underprivileged families in the area. She described her work with such authenticity that even Jack felt moved by her words. Just as he was about to respond, Liz appeared beside him, her expression a mixture of irritation and impatience. She wrapped her arm around his, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected shift in his attention. "Jack," she said, her voice carrying a slight edge, "I thought we were going to meet with Mr. Collins again. We need to talk about your proposal." Her tone was jarring, a sharp contrast to the warmth and sincerity in Sarah's voice. Jack hesitated, glancing between Liz and Sarah, feeling as though he were standing at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated. Liz's presence suddenly felt like a weight pulling him back, away from something he hadn't even realized he was longing for. Sarah gave him a brief, understanding smile. "I'll leave you to it," she said softly, stepping away from the group. But before she left, she looked Jack in the eyes, a quiet strength radiating from her. It was a look that spoke of patience, of resilience, but also of a sadness that he knew he had put there. As he watched her walk away, Jack felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was losing something precious, something he hadn't fully appreciated until this very moment. Jack stood in silence for a moment, watching Sarah as she walked away. The ache in his chest grew stronger, mixing with a dawning sense of clarity. He glanced over at Liz, who was now chatting with another guest, seemingly oblivious to his inner turmoil. Jack's mind, however, was far from the business deal or the polished charm he'd once admired. His thoughts remained on Sarah, her warmth, her kindness, and the effortless way she connected with people. He couldn't shake the image of her standing in that circle of guests, her smile lighting up the room in a way that felt real, unforced. In that brief interaction, Sarah had managed to do something that Liz, with all her beauty and poise, hadn't achieved all evening. She had made people feel valued, seen. The admiration from everyone around her hadn't been because of her appearance or connections, but because of who she was. Jack moved away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner where he could gather his thoughts. He leaned against a wall, his mind racing with memories of all the times Sarah had supported him. He thought back to the early days, when his business had been little more than a struggling startup, and Sarah had been the one working late into the night alongside him, helping wherever she could. She had believed in his dreams when few others did, offering encouragement, reassurance, and her unshakable faith in his potential. It was painful to realize how far he had strayed from that. He had spent so much time chasing the image of success, the polished perfection he believed would earn him respect, that he had lost sight of the person who had truly been his partner in every sense of the word. As he stood there, lost in thought, he felt someone approach him. He looked up to see Patrick Wallace, who gave him a knowing smile, as though he could read the emotions swirling in Jack's mind. "Looks like you've got a lot on your mind," Patrick said, his tone casual but perceptive. Jack forced a smile, but it felt hollow. Just thinking about how much things have changed. Patrick nodded, his gaze thoughtful. You know, Jack, I've been around a lot of people in this industry. People who are wealthy, powerful, successful. But I'll tell you this, true success doesn't come from the numbers in your bank account or the kind of company you keep. It comes from the people who stand by you, who make you a better person just by being in your life. Jack swallowed, his throat tight. Patrick's words echoed the thoughts he hadn't wanted to face. He glanced back toward the crowd, where he could see Sarah talking with a few guests, her expression warm and open as always. How had he let himself forget her worth? How had he allowed himself to believe that she wasn't enough, simply because she wasn't as polished or glamorous as the women he thought he should be around? You're right, Jack said quietly, more to himself than to Patrick. I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way. Patrick smiled, clapping a hand on Jack's shoulder. It's never too late to remember, he said with a gentle nod. Just don't wait too long to show her that you understand what she means to you. Jack felt the weight of those words settle heavily in his chest. As Patrick walked away, Jack was left alone with his thoughts, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and a quiet determination growing within him. He realized, standing there amidst the glittering lights and superficial smiles, that he didn't want a life built on empty appearances and shallow validations. He wanted something real, something he already had but had failed to appreciate. For the rest of the evening, he found himself observing Liz and Sarah from afar, feeling the stark contrast between them more acutely than ever. Liz was everything he thought he wanted, poised, striking, polished. But as the night wore on, he saw the shallow veneer, the lack of depth behind her carefully crafted charm. And each time he glanced at Sarah, he felt that pang of regret grow stronger. By the time the event began to wind down, Jack knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He was standing at a crossroads, with one path leading toward the life he had thought he wanted and the other towards something infinitely more precious, a life built on love, partnership, and genuine connection. As he watched Sarah one last time, he made a decision. The thrill of his ambition suddenly seemed hollow, and he understood that he could no longer chase after a vision of success that left Sarah behind. She was, and always had been, the person who made him better, who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. The path ahead would not be easy, he knew. But for the first time in a long time, he felt certain about the direction he needed to take. The event had finally come to an end. Guests began to disperse, the lively chatter fading to a low hum as people trickled out of the ballroom. Jack glanced around, watching as Sarah gathered her things, preparing to leave with a quiet grace that somehow managed to command more attention than Liz's polished charm. Before he could overthink it, Jack approached her. His heart pounded, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she noticed him, her expression remained neutral, but he could see a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or a quiet resignation that twisted his stomach. Sarah, do you have a moment? He asked softly, struggling to find the right words. She nodded, gesturing for him to continue as they moved to a quieter corner of the room. Look, Jack faltered, feeling an overwhelming rush of guilt as he stood before her. I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have, he paused, glancing away, unsure of how to explain everything in his mind. How could he convey the regret that was now consuming him? Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steady but laced with pain. Jack, I know you didn't want me here tonight, she began, her tone gentle but firm. I could see it in the way you looked at me, or rather, the way you didn't look at me. She paused, her gaze unwavering as she continued. I don't know when I stopped being enough for you, but it's clear that something has changed. Jack felt a painful lump form in his throat. He wanted to tell her how wrong he had been, how deeply he regretted the choices he'd made. But the words caught in his throat, tangled with years of pride and stubbornness. Sarah, you don't understand, he finally managed, his voice rough. It's not that you're not enough. I just thought I needed something else to fit into this world. I thought that if I could prove myself to these people, if I could make them see me as successful, then I would finally be someone worth admiring. Sarah's expression softened, though the sadness in her eyes remained. Jack, I've always admired you. I didn't need you to change or prove anything to anyone. I loved you for who you were. She took a small step back, as if trying to gather her thoughts. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your partner, your equal. And that hurts more than anything. Jack looked down, shame washing over him. He couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had let his ambition blind him to the love and support that Sarah had always given him, treating her as though she weren't worthy of the world he had so desperately wanted to conquer. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I wish I could go back and change things. Sarah's eyes glistened, but she held her composure. Jack, I don't need perfection. I don't need someone who chases after empty dreams while I wait in the background. I need a partner, someone who values me for who I am and sees the worth in what we've built together. Jack nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a night at a business event, it was about a pattern he had fallen into, one that had driven a wedge between them. His ambition had come at a cost, one he hadn't realized until now. Please, Sarah, he said, his voice barely holding steady. Give me a chance to make this right. I know I've been selfish, that I took you for granted. But I'm ready to change. I don't want this life if it means losing you. Sarah looked at him for a long, silent moment, as if weighing his words, deciding if they were enough. Finally, she let out a soft sigh. Jack, I've been by your side through everything. I believed in you when no one else did, because I saw something in you that was real. But I need to know that you see me, too, that you're willing to truly be here with me, and not just chase after something you think will make you feel important. Jack reached for her hand, holding it tightly as he nodded. I do. I see you, Sarah. And I know now that I've been looking in all the wrong places for validation. But you, our life together, that's what I should have valued from the start. There was a long pause as Sarah considered his words, her gaze softened but still uncertain. She nodded, finally. Jack, I'll give you one chance. But this is it. I need to know that you're committed to making us a priority, that you're willing to work for this. Jack's heart swelled with a mix of relief and determination. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, that he would have to prove himself every day. But standing here, looking into Sarah's eyes, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, he knew what he truly wanted, to rebuild the love and trust that he had so carelessly neglected. Thank you, Sarah, he whispered, his voice full of sincerity. I won't let you down. I promise. Sarah nodded, a hint of a sad smile appearing on her lips. We'll see, Jack. Actions speak louder than words. As she turned to leave, Jack stood rooted in place, watching her walk away. He knew she was right, this was his last chance to make things right. The emptiness he had felt all evening began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. He would do whatever it took to rebuild their bond, to show her that he was worthy of the love she had so freely given him all these years. He had been given a second chance, a gift he had no intention of wasting. Jack left the ballroom, feeling a weight settle on his shoulders that was heavier than any he'd ever carried. The memory of Sarah's words echoed in his mind, each one carving deeper into the guilt that had been simmering within him all evening. Her steady gaze, her quiet disappointment, everything about their confrontation had made him feel more vulnerable than he'd felt in years. As he walked through the quiet streets toward his car, Jack's thoughts drifted back to the early days of his relationship with Sarah. He remembered how she had always been by his side, cheering him on even when his business seemed like an impossible dream. Sarah had worked tirelessly to support him, not just financially or practically but emotionally, reminding him why he had chosen this path even on his darkest days. She had believed in him when no one else did, encouraging him to keep going, to push through every obstacle. How could he have forgotten that? How could he have let himself drift so far from the values they once shared? Jack reached his car and slid into the driver's seat, resting his head on the steering wheel for a long moment. The silent parking lot only amplified the echoes of his regrets. He thought about the countless nights he'd stayed late at the office, choosing work over time with Sarah, promising himself that it would all be worth it someday. But that day had never come, because he had always found something new to chase, another goal, another validation. And then there was Liz. What had seemed like an alluring escape from his responsibilities now felt empty, shallow. He had been drawn to Liz's confidence, her polished exterior, the image she projected that matched the vision of success he'd clung to for so long. But he could see now that he had been deceiving himself, trying to fill a void that only Sarah had ever truly filled. He felt the sting of regret deepening, a feeling of loss that threatened to overwhelm him. He knew that he couldn't erase the past, couldn't undo the mistakes he had made or the hurt he had caused. But Sarah had given him a lifeline, a chance to make things right. She had been clear, this was his final chance, and he couldn't afford to let it slip through his fingers. Jack sat up, taking a deep, steadying breath. He was determined to rebuild what he had broken, to show Sarah that he could be the partner she deserved. He understood that words would never be enough. He would have to show her, day by day, that he was committed to changing, to putting her first. When he finally started the car and drove home, Jack felt a flicker of hope amidst the sorrow. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he was ready to work for it, to fight for the love and trust that Sarah had so freely given him all these years. As he pulled into their driveway and stepped out into the cool night air, Jack looked up at the house they had built together. It was more than just a structure of bricks and wood, it was a symbol of their life, of the dreams they had once shared. He realized, standing there, that he wanted nothing more than to rebuild those dreams with her, to recapture the warmth and love that had once filled this space. Entering the house quietly, he found Sarah already asleep, her face peaceful, her breathing steady. Jack watched her for a moment, overwhelmed by the depth of his remorse and the resolve he felt taking root within him. He made a silent promise to himself and to her, to be better, to prove to her that he understood her worth and that he was willing to become the man she had always believed he could be. In that moment, Jack understood that this journey would be long, that there would be challenges and difficult conversations ahead. But as he watched Sarah sleep, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He would make things right, no matter what it took. The next morning, Jack woke up early, a renewed sense of determination guiding his actions. As he stepped into the kitchen, he found Sarah already there, sipping a mug of coffee and reading through some paperwork for her charity project. She looked up briefly, acknowledging him with a nod, but her expression remained guarded. Jack took a deep breath, walking over to stand beside her. "Sarah, I meant what I said last night," he began softly. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for a chance to show you that I can be better. That I can be the husband you deserve." Sarah's eyes held a mixture of sadness and quiet strength as she looked up at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying the weight of all the unspoken emotions that had built up over the years. Finally, she set her mug down, folding her hands together. "Jack, I've stood by you through so much. I've seen you at your best and at your worst. And I don't regret a single moment of it, because I believed in the man you were, the man I thought you still were." She paused, searching his face for sincerity. "But over time, it felt like I became invisible to you, like I was just a part of your life that didn't fit anymore." Her words stung, and Jack felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. "I know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm so sorry, Sarah. I can't go back and change the things I've done, but I can promise you that I'll spend every day working to make it up to you." Sarah sighed, her gaze softening slightly. "I appreciate that, Jack, but I need to see real change. I can't just pretend that everything is fine because you've promised to do better. Actions speak louder than words." Jack nodded, feeling the gravity of her words settle over him. This was no quick fix, he would have to earn her trust back, step by step. "Tell me what I need to do," he said earnestly. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it." She took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. "I need to know that you're committed to this, to us. That you're willing to put in the effort, not just for a week or a month, but for the long haul. I don't want empty promises, Jack. I need you to show me that I can trust you again." Jack reached out, covering her hands with his. "I understand, Sarah. I know I have a lot to prove. But I want you to know that I'm here, fully committed, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression softening as she squeezed his hands gently. "All right, Jack. I'll give you this chance, but only this one." She paused, her gaze steady. "You have to be prepared to rebuild this relationship from the ground up, with honesty, with patience, and with respect. And that means we have to talk, really talk, about what went wrong and how to move forward." Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. Her conditions were fair, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead if it meant restoring their relationship. "Thank you, Sarah. I promise, I'll be the husband you deserve." A faint smile crossed her lips, though a hint of sadness lingered in her eyes. "We'll see, Jack. This won't be easy, for either of us." Over the next few days, Jack made every effort to show Sarah that he was committed to change. He began by focusing on the small things, simple gestures of appreciation, being present in conversations, listening to her thoughts and ideas without distractions. He supported her in her charity work, offering to help in any way he could, taking an active interest in the causes that were so important to her. As the days turned into weeks, Jack found himself reconnecting with Sarah in ways he hadn't anticipated. He saw her passion, her unwavering dedication to her work, and it reminded him of the early days of their marriage, when they had dreamed and worked together, supporting one another's goals. Though Sarah remained cautious, Jack could sense a gradual shift in her demeanor. The walls she had built around her heart seemed to soften, allowing him glimpses of the warmth that he had missed for so long. She began to share more with him, inviting him into the world of her charitable work, showing him the impact her projects had on the community. Each moment spent together felt like a step toward healing, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Jack understood that he was only at the beginning of this journey. There would be no quick fix, no single act that would erase the mistakes of the past. But as he held Sarah's hand, walking beside her in this new chapter of their lives, he knew he was willing to put in the work, day by day, to prove to her that he was ready to be the partner she had always deserved. Their love, though battered and bruised, had endured. And as they faced the future together, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope, a belief that they could build something even stronger than before. Months had passed since the night of the gala, and Jack could feel the subtle but powerful changes in his life. Each day had been an opportunity to renew his commitment to Sarah, to prove that he could be the partner she deserved. He had learned to value the small, quiet moments with her, moments that once seemed insignificant in the shadow of his ambition but had now become the foundation of their healing. Jack had immersed himself in Sarah's world, actively participating in her charity projects, not out of obligation, but because he found fulfillment in them. He was genuinely moved by the impact of her work, the way her programs brought food, shelter, and hope to those in need. He had even taken on a mentorship role in the organization, sharing his business expertise to help streamline resources and expand outreach. For the first time, he felt that his skills and success served a purpose beyond himself. Their evenings were now spent not in silence or polite small talk, but in deep, meaningful conversations. Jack began to open up about his own insecurities, about the pressures he had felt to prove himself and how they had clouded his vision. Sarah listened with patience and empathy, her understanding giving him the space to be vulnerable, something he hadn't realized he needed. One weekend, they attended a community event together, hosted by Sarah's charity. It was a simple gathering, a fundraiser and thank you celebration for the volunteers and local families who had benefited from the programs. Jack watched as Sarah moved through the crowd, her smile warm and welcoming, stopping to speak with each person, making them feel valued and appreciated. As he stood by her side, he felt a quiet pride he hadn't experienced before. Not the pride of someone who wanted to be admired or respected, but the pride of a man who knew he was standing beside someone truly remarkable. At the end of the evening, as they walked home through the quiet streets, Jack reached for Sarah's hand. She took it without hesitation, and they walked in comfortable silence, the cool night air filling the space between them with a gentle peace. When they reached their front door, Jack paused, turning to face her. "Sarah, I can't thank you enough for giving me this chance. I know it hasn't been easy, but I want you to know that I see you now. I see everything you've done for me, for us, and I'll never take that for granted again." Sarah's eyes softened, her expression one of quiet acceptance. "I can see the change, Jack. I felt it. And I'm proud of you for putting in the effort, for making the choice to be present with me. That means more than you know." Jack nodded, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "I'll keep proving it to you," he said quietly. "I promise." They stood there in silence for a moment, letting the warmth of their connection fill the space between them. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a deep sense of contentment, a feeling that had eluded him in all his years of chasing success. He had found a truer form of success, one that was grounded not in wealth or status, but in love, partnership, and a shared purpose. Over the coming months, Jack and Sarah's relationship continued to strengthen. Their bond, once fragile, had become resilient, built on a newfound respect and understanding. They were more than husband and wife, they were partners, supporting each other not only in their individual goals but in the life they were rebuilding together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jack took her hand, gazing at her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "Thank you, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." She smiled, her eyes filled with the same quiet strength that had always defined her. "I think we both have a lot to be thankful for," she replied softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "This feels right, doesn't it?" "It does," Jack agreed, a smile crossing his face as he realized the truth in her words. "It feels more than right. It feels real." In that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack knew he had finally found his place, not in boardrooms or glittering events, but here, beside Sarah, in the quiet, genuine love they had reclaimed together. And as they sat there, watching the sky fade to twilight, Jack felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that he had everything he'd ever truly needed. Their journey had been long, marked by mistakes and lessons, but they had come through it stronger, bound by a love that had endured and blossomed anew. Together, they looked toward the future, hopeful and united, ready to face whatever lay ahead, side by side.